Talk about that. Do you think that...
And giving them money and let them defend themselves a little better might be part of the answer.
Joe, Nick, one of the pieces that you and I worked on together at Texas Monthly was a piece called Boone Pickens Wants Your Water. This was back in, I think, 2003.
He wants to sell you his water.
Well, they're kind of the same thing,
yeah.
Isn't it? You took a dim view then, and I guess from what you said today, take a dim view now of people who look at water as something to make a profit of.
Well, you know, and Andy made a good point. We don't respect it in the two most water-short cities in Texas. El Paso and San Antonio have done a wonderful job in conserving. El Paso has implemented strategies. They have desal plants that are working. And as I've tried to understand the water issues, and it goes back to visiting a friend of mine's family farm east of Fort Stockton, where there were once 200 truck farms that all of a sudden went away when Comanche Springs, the largest springs in West Texas, dried up because they started pumping irrigating the desert with pecan fields west of town. And that's the same springs that now Clayton Williams is trying to sell his water to Midland, even though Midland has not asked for any water. They've secured their water supplies. And so I've learned a little bit about the rule of capture. And Lucius Bunton, the judge that passed that basically decreed the landmark legislation on the Edwards Aquifer, told me after then, it's too bad. Texas should have two sets of water. Rule of capture works fine in the eastern part of the state, east of I-35. West Texas, you're spoiling for a fight. So the next logical means, and certainly Senate Bill 1 in 1997 told me as a citizen, your best control, we're not going to do away with rule of capture, it exists, and it's not going to go away, but groundwater districts are your best means of control, local control over every different area. All well and good, but the districts that have been overly conservative in letting water leave their area are getting penalized. They've been beat up. They've been hit with lawsuits. And I think I worry about this session where groundwater districts' power to control local destiny is going to be taken away by the state. And that's the Boone story in a nutshell. Boone sued the Hemphill County groundwater district along with another landowner because they determined we don't want to lose any more than 20% of our water over the next 50 years that's in our water district. So all well and good, they took local assertive action. And I always thought that you follow the food chain down. If you don't like the feds, well, let's take it one step down lower. The state does a good job, but really, shouldn't we have local control? The districts are it, and the state is using a very big baseball bat to browbeat them to make them spend most of their money on defending their decisions rather than doing good science. So we have not advanced that far since we did that Boone story.
Dr. McKinney, before I ask Carter to offer the state perspective, I guess you would offer the state perspective, right? Do you have a point of view you want to throw in here about this?
Well, I think you understand why these folks are on this panel, because I think it covered it very well. I just emphasize one point on, we were talking about value of water, and I think that's something that I see a lot. And when we look at this bottled water like we have up here, of course, that's some of the most expensive water that you can have, but most people, when they turn the tap on, they expect water to come out, and they really don't understand what's all behind that. It's basically free. It's for the transport of it is what the costs are. And so when you see places where water is really valued, like when you have $4 and $5 gallon for gasoline, for that type of thing, when water gets that high, you see conservation measures step in and begin to happen. So unfortunately, it may be until we get to that point that we really appreciate that water and start taking all these steps that we're saying we should do now. And that's unfortunate, because now we have a lot of options to look at how to conserve water that we will not have when it gets to that point.
And just pick an option that you would put in front of this group and say, this is something that we all ought to be spending more time on.
Andy hit the best one, I think, the very easiest one and cost effective, and that is just cleaning up our infrastructure that transports water that is so leaky and old and out of condition. By doing that, you actually save enough money to pay for those types of things in most cases. That's a very simple option we ought to do now.
Andy, you estimated, you said it's 50% in some places, but on average it's probably
25 to 30.
25-30%. And if that water could be preserved by being responsible stewards, be used and all that, the problem that we identify would diminish dramatically.
For those of us who are concerned with fish and wildlife and environmental issues, we know where the water is going to come from if it begins to disappear.
Right.
That historically has been the case, and it's understandable people are going to take care of their best interest, but it's difficult to make the case that their best interest is actually the environment in which they live. That needs to be part of that decision. So we know where it will come from, and that's a concern of
the dominoes all fall.
Mm-hmm.
Carter, let me put you in the position of speaking on behalf of the Parks and Wildlife Department, and you heard 5 people with a point of view about what we ought to be doing. We as a large community, where do you come down on this?
Well, and I'll share a couple of observations. I mean, certainly I'll reinforce the commitment to conservation. That is the proverbial low-hanging fruit, and I think we can make a lot of headway in that regard. I think another observation that is important for this audience to understand is that we conduct statewide assessments all the time about public attitudes towards various issues associated with the environment, and the issue that inevitably rises to the top, irrespective of political, social, or economic background, is water. It's always identified as the #1 issue, and particularly when you get to the importance of people's drinking water.
Well, you've done polling, or there's been polling done that we've all seen that shows that far and away that's the issue people are most concerned about.
Absolutely, and that people are unequivocally committed to protecting it.
Right.
You know, I think the other thing is I've listened to the discussion here. It really gets at the fundamental issues associated with water and water policy. Where's it going to come from? Who's going to get it, and how much are they going to get? And we all have our interests in the answer to those questions. I mean, whether we're in agriculture, industry, or a municipality, or the environment. But I think the discussion on the markets associated with water, I mean, I'll offer this observation. Those markets exist, and to pretend otherwise, I think, is ignoring a fundamental reality, both in groundwater and surface water. And so, while Joe, Nick, and I share a lot of common views about the importance of protecting water for our environment, I do think we also have to use those markets to our advantage when we want to pursue conservation solutions.
Give me an example of how that might be done.
Well, I'll get a great example, of course, is most recently in San Antonio, where the source, the drinking water for that city, the 7th largest city in the United States, comes solely from the Edwards Aquifer. And the city has invested on multiple occasions and shown a willingness to dedicate a 1/8-cent sales tax to acquire land to protect water quality lands over the recharge zone for the Edwards Aquifer. And so that's taking advantage of that marketplace to buy something that's of value to the people of San Antonio. And so
was that an asserted policy on behalf of the city? City just said we're going to do this and didn't put this to a public vote or public referendum?
The city took it to vote, and the citizens overwhelmingly have supported that. And in fact, I think the 3rd ballot initiative was most recently approved back in November.
And Andy, you were alluding to San Antonio's confronting this problem. You're referring to what Carter's referring to?
Well, actually, I was referring to the measures that the city has taken to conserve water, but Carter makes probably one of the most important points I think that we could discuss this afternoon, which is that Texas is a state which is almost entirely owned by private citizens. And what that means is that all of the watersheds, the recharge areas, and areas that literally the first raindrops fall on are exposed to adverse uses. And we really don't do enough to protect those watersheds. When Mary talks about the Texas Water Plan, which envisions spending some $31 billion over the next 50 years for water infrastructure, there's no mention in there about things like purchasing development rights from private landowners to protect watersheds. If we don't find a way to keep families on ancestral land in Texas, we're going to do the greatest amount of damage to our water system.
Carter, what Andy refers to is an emerging line of, I think, of argument about which there's much agreement, that keeping families on lands and not opening up private lands to development that would exacerbate this problem is an important virtue. But let me segue with that into the second topic here, which is water as line item. You know, you may have heard we have a shortfall. And this is not a time for the state to be doing a whole lot of investment spending, even on behalf of things that have long-term value. There's not a lot of appetite for that. And so a lot of the things that you're hearing discussed here cost money. Your budget at the Parks and Wildlife Department in the appropriations that are being discussed this week, and this may not be where it ends up, but it's where it is now, cuts 25% of your department's budget. $170 million over the biennium. How much of that impacts water directly?
Well, almost all of it in some form or fashion. I mean, I will say it's abundantly clear that we're going to have to do our job with less resources, but that doesn't mean that we abandon our focus and work on water. You know, as the budget now sits, there are going to be less resources for things like controlling invasive species, for shrimp buyback programs and other things that the citizens have strongly supported over the years, but still very much contemplates our work involved in water policy and planning and making sure that we're working very closely with river authorities and other stakeholders, municipalities, industry, et cetera, on designing the future of our state's water and making sure that fish and wildlife considerations are well represented. And so we're certainly not going to abandon that purpose and cause, even in lean times.
But the issue is not simply that there's not new money for new programs, it's that there's less money for old programs, and that some of the progress you've made over the years might be eroded by having to cut back on some things you've been doing.
Well, and certainly we'll see that in places like state parks. There's no doubt about that.
Right.
When it comes to our water policy work, that's largely the work of very specialized water policy experts and water attorneys with the department, and so we absolutely plan to keep them committed to those endeavors.
David, you heard Carter talk about revenue raised at the local level. Joe Nick talked about local control. Others did as well. Would you favor, as an advocate for water, putting into the hands of communities like San Antonio, Austin, the opportunity to pony up a little bit? If the state can't afford to do this, then the local control issue should be put on the table?
Well, I was going to jump in when they were talking, because Austin and San Antonio are two perfect examples. They have, as Andy alluded to, they have figured out that water originates where the first raindrop falls, whether it's surface water or groundwater. And the least expensive, broadest way to pay for conservation and supply is to concentrate on that supply where the first raindrop falls. And if you keep good land stewards on the land through those programs like Austin and San Antonio have decided to do, that's the bottom line answer, and that's probably the cheapest way. And it took us so long to figure that out. And when you have examples all over the United States and other places and all over the world. One of the best being, Perrier made a deal with the farmers upstream not to destroy the spring that produces that bubbly water they put in those little green bottles and sell all over the world. So if we figure out a way to keep land stewards on the land, contributing water, both surface water and groundwater, and protecting the springs, and not having their conservation efforts stolen by the people who want to sell the water, unless there's some sort of payment for or some sort of equitable solution for conservation. Right now, all of the incentives are to sell. There's no incentive to conserve. In fact, you're penalized if you conserve. Somebody takes
talk about how that is. How exactly are you penalized for conserving?
Well, the first example I gave in my opening comments, we've lost 50 feet of our groundwater.
Oh, so you're using your own examples?
Yeah. I mean, we can go on. The most beautiful example Joe Nick and I were talking about, and everybody in the room knows David Bamberger. In fact, his land practices, no wells, his land practices generate water into the Colorado River system, and his reward is that the river authorities and the municipalities take the water that he generates and sells it. Totally eliminate him from the profit. There's no incentive other than he wants to do it in his heart. And you'd be amazed how many private land stewards out there who feel exactly the same way. And their reward is their efforts are penalized, and then on top of that, you send the chief appraiser to hassle them about their property taxes.
Mary, talk about that. You think?